All right, so today I have Rob here. We're doing a new segment called "Should You Buy This Deal?" And Rob's a client of mine in the program, and basically he has a deal, and we look through it together, and he's trying to decide whether to buy it or not. So that's kind of the goal here, is to show you guys the process, the nitty gritty details of what it looks like to potentially buy a multifamily deal. So with that being said, Rob, do you mind kind of walking through the beginning of this deal, how you found it, and everything like that?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for having me on. Program's been great. I've learned a ton through it, and I really appreciate the guidance. But yeah, this deal, um, I found it, a few weeks back. It was on market, traditional, sourcing. There wasn't anything fancy off market or anything like that. I saw it was sitting off on market for, a little bit too long, close to 100 days, and I was like, there's probably something going on with it. Um, but I thought I'd underwrite it anyway. The numbers kind of checked out, which we'll get into. Um, you know, we'll find out kind of why I'm ending up passing on it. So it kind of was a little bit too good to be true, even with a little bit of a purchase price reduction from the list price. But yeah, this deal came to market at 1.75 purchase price. Got him down to 1.6 and was like at the very, very final stages of LOI at 1.6. And then after talking with you and kind of going through it, realized that it was not a good deal to start on.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, in this case, just to give an overview, right? 18 unit deal, 1.6. This is kind of what the capital stack looks like, right? So
Yeah.
renovations of 250K, deal cost 50K, reserves 10K, 24K acquisition fee. So all in for like 1.9 million, right? Which is just over 100K unit on these
Right.
18 units, right?
Yep. Yep.
Um, so that was kind of the basic level of the deal, right? If you look at it, debt would have been around a million. The rest is coming from equity, with the split between the GP and LP, right?
Yep.
That's
Yep.
kind of the basic deal here. Um, and I guess what kind of stood out to you initially? Like, why do you initially like the deal?
I liked it initially. So one of the first things I'll do, if you scroll over a little bit to the right, so the first thing I do when I see a deal is like, first, let's get the rent roll in, let's get the expenses in. But even before that, let's look at the market and see what's the average um current, what's the average rent for, in this case, two bed, two bath, and then what's the potential rent post renovation? Like, are there renovated units in the area that, like, is there any lift? Like, that's the first thing to look for. Are these units already renovated? Like, if they are, there's probably no lift for a model like this, like that you talk about, and that we're looking for. If there's no lift, there's really a deal's not going to pencil. So we need to find at least some sort of spread between the current rents and post renovation rents. And even better if we can find a spread between the current rents and the unrenovated rents, right? So first we put, all of the data in, we put in the rent roll and we put in the expenses. I saw that there was a really big lift between what these current units were getting and what units not even a mile or two away were getting that were renovated. And it was like a pretty decent spread. And if you go up, you can kind of see that a little bit right there. So the 1050 to the 1275, 225, and then you see, like, I have a good connection with a contractor who was able to, I was able to just call him and say, like, hey, you know, we have two bed, two bath in this market. Here are some things that we would want to do. Is this a reasonable cost per unit? And it actually turned out being exactly in the ballpark of kind of what is in your program. I remember one of the articles saying like 10 for cosmetic, or 10 to 15, right? That's what we were thinking.
Mhm.
And so the return on cost at 19 is like all promising. So then all this stuff, all these elements kind of come into play, and it's like, okay, great. Like, there's momentum, there's lift, there's a good return on cost. There's and then I go in and plug the stabilized expenses in to the left and column P right there. And I think this is a really conservative assumption in going from 70K to 92 and increasing the NOI margin from 60 to 65. So I felt really, really comfortable about the pro forma P&L. Um, and those expenses are like coming in day one in the model. So the numbers all worked, right? Like, it made a lot of sense, I
Yeah, I was
think.
saying just to give like kind of a quick overview here, right? Basically, what's happening is you're starting off with this kind of rent roll right here, right? Which is basic current rents, roughly around 1,000, right? Obviously, you have some lagging and some a little bit above, but roughly around 1,000. You're taking those to 1,275. Then you kind of look at the in-place numbers here on the expenses, right? You're taking the expenses come from 70 to 92K. Really, that's driven by mainly management fees and a few increases to taxes and insurance.
Yep.
Everything else is staying a little pretty much consistent here. Um,
Yep.
and that gets you to roughly, right, an 8.67% stabilized yield, right? And the market cap rate's around 7%. So face value, right, you have 167 basis points of spread here, which is good, right? That's what you're looking for. Typically, 150 basis points plus is what you're looking for. And to make matters better, right? If you look at this in-place DSCR, and for those of you who don't know, the DSCR is just the NOI divided by, I'll show you right here, divided by the debt service for the year. And banks are typically looking for 1.25 to give you a loan. So in this case, you're able to get a loan, right? Longer term
Yep.
debt on the property with lift, getting up to 150 basis points plus stabilized yield. That's an attractive deal. And that's kind
Yep.
of what Rob saw initially. And he was like, okay, this deal makes sense.
Yeah. And I really just, once I saw that, I was like, finally, I've been underwriting deals for like months at this point. And as you and probably most of the people listening know, like everything seems to be overpriced. There seems to be zero lift, and it's pretty easy to get discouraged when you're just underwriting deals all the time. And you're like, even if I get this at a 10% discount, it still doesn't make sense. So then finally one comes along and it's like, holy shit, there's lift here. Sorry, you can bleep that out. Like holy whatever, there's lift here. I would like, it's awesome to see a deal that works. Like, let me just go on it. Let me get an LOI in, and just start running with it. Um, but yeah, there were definitely a couple of things that I found and kind of realized along the way that made this deal fall apart. And I can get into those, or if you have any questions, I can answer those.
Yeah. Why don't you kind of get into, so everything, we're at the point where everything looks good, right? Why
Yeah.
don't you get into like what you found under the hood that didn't really make as much sense once you looked further?
Sure. So the first thing, so there's really the two biggest drivers in this model are, if you scroll down a little bit, the market cap rate, right? That 7% market cap rate. And then also up and to the right, the post renovation rent that we have at 1275, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the two biggest value drivers of this model. And I begin to be less and less confident of both of those. And then the third reason why this thing didn't work and isn't ideal for a first deal is because the immediate submarket is pretty dangerous. There's a news article out on this exact street saying there was a shooting and somebody died in 2024. So it's like, do I really want my first deal to be that risky in terms of safety? Like, is that a headache that I want to? If it's a 300 basis point spread, maybe it makes sense. But in this case, it's like it's 150. You know, there's other questions with the assumptions like that added on top. It's like, all right, this is just not it, and that's okay. But like, this is just not it. But starting with the uh, market cap rate there. So I work in real estate private equity, and like you did previously, and we always feel really comfortable underwriting an exit cap at the same as our entry cap. Um, the problem here is that I'm potentially buying this too high. And the way that I kind of figured that out is if you see the cap rate in G and H to the left. So the broker's cap rate on his number, which is the package NOI, is 119, 765. So the cap rate at a 1.6 purchase price is a 7.5 cap. And I'm like, well, it's not actually a 7.5 cap. It's really a 671 cap. Like that's the actual that we're getting to with right. So it's like, well, which is it? Like, are we buying it at a 671? Or are we buying it at a 7.5? Well, the only difference between those two cap rates is one tenant who's in the pipeline being leased. So there's two vacancies in place right now. If one of them gets leased, which it's on the way to being leased, the cap rate immediately goes from 6.6 3/4 to 7.5. And it's like, all right, so it sounds like we're kind of buying this thing at a 7.5. So, and we're underwriting a 7 cap exit. So it's like, we're gonna have vacancy in place on the exit, but only for one unit. And I'm sorry if I'm not explaining this perfectly, but essentially I had concerns with the exit cap rate. And I'm like, if this thing is stabilized in this market, can it really go for a 7 cap?
Yeah, and it's like, look, if you move this to a 7.5, right? We haven't looked at the returns that much, but it
Right,
matters a ton, right? That's 50 basis points,
right,
right? Let's just look here at the returns. So this is the current levered IRR, right? These are the LP returns, and this is kind of the carry, promote, everything like that, right? So let's just see what happens if we move this to a 7.5. Right, just to show again, right? This was at 18.39% and at 1.5, right? It's a big
yeah,
difference, right? Now you're at 13% and 1.35.
yeah,
Right? So not only does it drop the returns, but it also really decreases the margin in the deal. And when you go from having 150 basis points of spread to roughly 100, that's a big difference, right? Now,
yeah,
if something, one or two things don't go your way, you could be in a bit of trouble. And that's kind of what you saw there.
yep, yep. And then next I could talk about the post renovation rent because that's just as much, if not more, of a value driver in this deal. So the first thing I'm looking at when I see this deal, it's like, okay, the rents are $1,000. There are other units in the market that are like a mile and a half away, if that, that are going for 13, 14, even 14.50, close to 15 hundred a month. And it's like, okay, if that's the case, then close to 1,300, 1,275 has got to be a conservative number. And I ran with that for a while as I was negotiating the LOI and as we're underwriting the deal and I'm beginning to talk to investors. And then I realized like the nature of this submarket is really confined and it's a smaller market already. Like the general market's small. So the submarket's really small. And none of those comps that I was looking at were the immediate submarket, right? So I was looking at properties that were, 3/4 of a mile or a mile away that looked like great comps. But when you look at a crime map, when you look at a map of the average household income, it's drastically different. It's one of those markets where like 3 streets down is the nice part of town, and 3 streets the other way is a terrible part of town. And this was in the terrible part of town. The asset had been kept up really well. It looked good on pictures. It looked good on the brochure. Um, and even on Street View, it looked great. But when you go on Street View and you go down the road a little bit, it's like boarded up houses and it looks like Section 8. So it's just like, okay, maybe that post renovation market rent is not there either. And it felt like the submarket that the people that would be living there don't really care about stainless steel appliances, new countertops, and new bathroom hardware. So I became less and less confident in that number as well.
Yeah, and that's a really good point in that the market rent, right? When people think of market rent, sometimes they just think it's the rent for the entire overall market. In
Yep.
reality, it's a lot more nuanced than that. And you end up having a rent that is really what I like to think of as kind of the 3 to 5 most applicable properties. You kind of take that number. And most likely those are closer, obviously it does depend on the market, but most likely those are closer than 3/4 of a mile away.
Yeah.
So that's something that's really important. You really just can't take a market average and just say like people will do this all the time. They'll look at like the market report and be like, oh, the market report says it's 12.75. Like I'm just going to slap this on the deal.
Yep.
That's not how it works, right? You really need to look at this specific deal, the most applicable comps, and go from there.
Yep. Yep. And digging into this deal has maybe not changed my philosophy, but definitely made me want to look for because this is like the nicest asset in this submarket, right? So it's like
Mhm.
it makes me want to change from looking at the nicest asset in a terrible submarket to like a lower end asset in a great submarket. I'd feel much more comfortable in that situation.
And that's exactly what you should think of, right? The
Yep.
lowest asset in a better submarket is almost always better.
Yep.
Just because it's location matters, right? You can have as many numbers on a spreadsheet as you want, but at the end of the day, if tenants aren't paying rent, if you have to evict all the time, that really impacts the spreadsheet, right? If it's more difficult to manage, also the worse the submarket, the worse the exit cap is going to be, right? Because
Yep.
people don't want to be in it as much. They're not going to expect so much future rent growth. So it kind of flows through to everything, and it's easy to get caught up in the spreadsheet, but in reality, the location is very, very important.
Yeah. 100%. I mean, I can make any deal look good on a spreadsheet. I can make any deal you put in front of me look great on a spreadsheet, and I can even defend all the assumptions on it. And it's just, but like you have to live in reality on this stuff. Like you have to look at the details and understand the sub market and what you're actually going to get, and be conservative there.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add too is just even with this underwriting, right, you have kind of the in place and the stabilized. If you do start increasing some of these stabilized numbers, right, just assume um, some sort of cost increases as you stabilize, right? Let's just say do a 3% increase, right? That's going to hit the stabilized yield as well,
Yep.
right? And that kind of, I guess it's not that bad there. But then you kind of combine that if there is the same loss to lease that the seller experienced, that's a big number, right?
Yeah.
24K, just to give an idea of value here. 300K value,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So that's a big number. And obviously that this is not just dependent on the current this property here. It's really dependent on how everything's operating in the submarket. And that's how you kind of look at the loss to lease, not just based on this property. But overall, it's a big number. And once you start adding all these together, right, you start looking at, okay, maybe the market cap rate should be a bit higher. Maybe the market rent should be a bit lower. Maybe these expenses should be a bit higher. Maybe we need some loss to lease. It really starts beating up the numbers. And that's kind of what you saw.
Yeah. Yep. That's exactly right. And yeah, anything else? Any other details you want to dig into?
No, I mean, I guess really what did you learn from this process? Like what's your biggest takeaway after looking at this deal?
Yeah, so I'll talk about what I've learned in this process, and I'd also like to take a second and talk about what I've learned in the course. So in this process, I've definitely learned to look at crime maps earlier on in the process than, getting ready to call the lawyer to get a contract in place. Um, the sub market is more important than the market in most cases. Um, and yeah, you just have to be really, really tight with your assumptions. Um, I can underwrite, I can model, I can make any deal look pretty good in a model. I can make a good deal look amazing in a model. Um, and like you can go in circles all day with, I mean, I spent 30 minutes one day trying to decide what sort of inflation factor I should put on expenses. And it's like that's not getting me closer to getting this deal done. Like if it was a good enough deal, I wouldn't be worried about that. Right. So yeah, all the above. And then also like as far as your course, man, I really, really appreciate your perspective on real estate. Even working in the industry, our hold periods are a little bit longer than I think what you're going after. Probably 5 to 7, getting closer to 7 to 10 these days. But like the capitalized value model of real estate, um, it's like it's like 30K of NOI at a six cap is $500,000 or close to it, right? It's a lot. And so yeah, I really, really appreciate all the stuff that I've learned. I think what you're doing is awesome, and I've learned a ton.
Definitely. No, I'm glad to hear that. It means a lot. I mean, I think it's pretty cool too, because I feel like once you see people fully learn the process, like I think you have, it's nice to just watch them kind of like really understand it, go
Yeah,
from like not you're in a zero, but starting out at zero, but you do like I feel like you really get it now. And I think look, it's all a process, and that's what I always like to say is right. You look at one deal and it doesn't work, that's fine, right? You just take what you learned and go on to the next deal. And I think now every deal you look at, you have all of these lessons that you can just say, okay, this is exactly what I'm not going to do going forward. This is what I am going to do going forward. And it's going to lead you to a deal.
yep. And yeah, I agree with that completely. And I've learned more in the like 2 or 3 weeks underwriting this deal and actually trying to negotiate an LOI, and getting investors on the phone. Like I built relationships with investors that I wouldn't have talked to yet because of this deal. And so like you're completely right. The lessons that I've learned just by pursuing this and like trying to get legs under it has been more than I could have just sitting behind a computer, not talking to anybody and sitting in an Excel model.
Yeah. And no one ever listens when I say this, but the most important thing is being in the game.
Yep.
Right. Like once you're in the game, you're in the game. Right now you're looking at deals, you have investors who know you, right? And they're primed for the next deal. You have brokers who know you, they're primed for the next deal. You have lenders who know you. It all compounds, right? And if you never go deep and kind of dive into the weeds, you're never going to get anywhere, right? Like if all you
Yep,
do is like look at deals on LoopNet, you look at the purchase price and say, it doesn't work. You're not going to get anywhere. You have to actually
yep,
underwrite deals. You have to go through the process. Yes, you can waste some time up front, but it's really not wasting time when you learn from it.
100%, 100%.
Cool. Well, yeah, look, thanks for coming on. I think this is a really, really cool first installment. I'm going to try and do this again where we kind of go through deals, why they did work, why they didn't work, and just what you can uncover during underwriting to really help people through the process themselves.
Yep. Awesome. Well, I appreciate being a part of it. I really do. And maybe I can get on one for the first after we close the first one.
Yeah, yeah, I'd love to have you on there once you close one.
Awesome. Really appreciate it, man.